You ever deal with people who think their little scrap of authority makes them the absolute king of the world, like their suburban kingdom is somehow above the actual law? Yeah, me too, but mine wasn't just some keyboard warrior or a petty bureaucrat. Mine was a homeowners association president, and he decided his power extended right onto my property, past my fence line, and into my locked barn. What he and his little crony didn't factor into their pathetic power play was what was waiting inside that dark barn. 5 massive, pedigree bulls, adding up to about 15,000 pounds of extremely unimpressed, very suddenly disturbed beef on the hoof. If you like stories about petty tyrants getting a harsh lesson in reality, and maybe a few scrapes along the way, stick around, because this one involves criminal trespass, property destruction, terrified HOA officials, and the beautiful, simple physics of very large, very annoyed farm animals. Drop a comment if you've ever had an HOA nightmare. You'll definitely appreciate where this story went. My place isn't actually in the Havenwood Estates development, it borders it. I bought the 20 acres specifically because it wasn't part of an HOA. I wanted space, privacy, the freedom to have a slightly imperfect life without passive-aggressive notices slipped under my door, and crucially, the ability to run my small-scale cattle operation without seeking approval from a committee worried about matching mailbox fonts. My land backs onto their designated natural buffer zone, which is basically a narrow strip of patchy grass and neglected scrub they rarely maintain but frequently fret about. My main barn sits maybe 50 yards from that property line. It's an old, sturdy structure, weathered but solid, which I use for equipment storage and, most importantly, for housing my 5 main breeding bulls. They're big boys, mostly Charolais and Angus mixes, gentle giants in their element. But like any animal that weighs as much as a small truck, they command respect and definitely do not appreciate surprises. I made sure my perimeter fencing was impeccable, not just county code compliant, but genuinely secure. And I had clear, professional, no trespassing signs posted prominently along the entire shared property line. You couldn't miss them unless you were deliberately trying to. From the beginning, President Mitchell, a man whose perceived authority seemed inversely proportional to his actual stature, viewed my working ranch as an irritating deviation from the beige uniformity he enforced within Havenwood. The first signs of trouble were minor, almost laughable. An email, forwarded via a secretary who sounded slightly embarrassed, complained that the color of my fence facing their buffer zone wasn't harmonious with the community's aesthetic guidelines. I politely replied, pointing out that my property wasn't subject to their guidelines and that the fence was entirely on my side of the line. Mitchell himself then sent a registered letter demanding I trim a stand of oak trees on my property because they supposedly cast too much shade on a corner of their rarely used common area picnic spot. Again, I politely declined, citing property rights and suggesting they plant some shade-tolerant flowers if it was such a dire concern. Mitchell seemed constitutionally incapable of understanding where his authority ended. I remember one Saturday morning finding him standing just on his side of the property line, clipboard in hand, peering intently at my main equipment shed. He actually waved me over. "Just conducting a visual assessment," he announced, puffing his chest out. "Need to ensure structures adjacent to the community meet certain visual standards." I reminded him firmly, but still politely, that he had absolutely no jurisdiction over my ranch. "Mitchell, your HOA rules stop right at that fence line. My visual standards are my business." He retorted something about protecting property values for his residents, implying my rustic barn was dragging down the resale value of houses half a mile away. I just shook my head and went back to my chores, making a mental note that this guy wasn't just a stickler. He had a genuine Napoleon complex. He truly seemed to believe his elected position in a suburban HOA gave him quasi-governmental powers over anyone within his line of sight. The bulls were mostly just background noise at this point, their occasional, deep bellows echoing harmlessly. Little did I know they were destined to become central figures in Mitchell's unfolding drama. My desire was simply to be left alone. Mitchell's desire, apparently, was to extend his beige tentacles of conformity over everything he could see. Whispers started, relayed by a friendly neighbor, Sarah, who lived inside the HOA. Mitchell was telling people the farm smells were drifting over, impossible, given the prevailing winds, and that the bull noises were disruptive, painting me as an uncooperative outsider deliberately blighting their suburban utopia. The stage was being meticulously set for a major conflict. The focus of Mitchell's obsession soon narrowed laser-like onto my barn. The polite emails and registered letters took on a sharper, more official tone. Suddenly, my perfectly legal, agriculturally zoned barn was an unapproved outbuilding, creating an aesthetic nuisance. This, despite it being there decades before Havenwood Estates was even a blueprint. I continued to respond factually, citing county records, zoning ordinances, and the deed to my property. My politeness was wearing thin, replaced by a growing irritation at having to continually defend my fundamental rights against this bureaucratic mosquito. Mitchell, undeterred by facts or law, escalated again. He announced the formation of a new subcommittee, the Community Adjacency Standards Committee, which sounded grand but consisted solely of himself and his primary sycophant, Gary. Gary was the type of guy who probably enjoyed handing out parking tickets. Being Mitchell's right-hand man was likely the peak of his life's achievements. Their official duty, they claimed, was to monitor and report on properties bordering the community that might negatively impact the character or safety of Havenwood. In reality, this meant Mitchell and Gary started spending an unhealthy amount of time lurking near my property line. I'd see them standing there, sometimes with binoculars, pointing towards my barn and the pasture where the bulls grazed peacefully. It went from irritating to downright creepy. One afternoon, they got bolder. They were right at the fence, Mitchell gesturing emphatically towards the barn, Gary nodding vigorously. I walked over. "Find something interesting, gentlemen?" I asked, keeping my voice level. Mitchell launched into a pre-rehearsed speech about the structural integrity of my barn, claiming it posed a potential risk if it collapsed towards HOA property, a physical impossibility. He then segued into renewed complaints about the bulls. "Those enormous creatures," he called them, "are frankly intimidating to our residents using the nature trail." He demanded access to my property, specifically the barn, to conduct a safety inspection. I flatly refused. "Mitchell, we've been over this. You have no authority here. This is private property. My barn's integrity is checked regularly, and it's none of your business. My bulls are securely contained on my land, far from your trail. You are not coming onto my property." I decided to record this conversation openly, holding my phone up. "And for the record, I am recording this refusal and your continued attempts to assert authority where you have none." Mitchell sputtered, face turning bright red. "This is unacceptable. Your lack of cooperation forces us to consider other avenues. We may have to report this to higher authorities." Pure bluster. "You do whatever you feel you need to do, Mitchell," I said calmly, "but stay off my property." They retreated, muttering threats about bylaws and community safety. I meticulously saved the audio recording and the photos of their snooping. I felt like I was building a case file, though I hoped I'd never need it. The irony was thick. I bought land away from an HOA to avoid exactly this kind of petty tyranny, only to have it bleed over the property line anyway. The ignition point came on a Tuesday afternoon. I'd driven into town for a couple of hours to pick up supplies and grab lunch. Everything seemed normal when I left. The bulls were lounging in their pasture. The barn was securely locked. Mitchell and Gary were nowhere in sight. I returned around 3 p.m., pulling my truck up the gravel drive towards the barn. Something felt off immediately. The heavy-duty weatherproof padlock I used on the main sliding barn door wasn't hanging in its usual place. I got out of the truck, my heart pounding a little faster. As I got closer, I saw it. The thick shackle of the padlock was bent, mangled, lying uselessly on the dusty ground. My eyes shot to the door itself. Fresh, deep scratches and gouges scarred the wood around the frame. Clear evidence of a pry bar or similar tool being used to force it open. Someone had deliberately broken into my barn. My first thought wasn't even about Mitchell. It was pure cold fury mixed with a shot of adrenaline-fueled worry. The bulls. Were they hurt? Had they gotten loose? I slid the big door open. It protested slightly, warped from the force used to break the lock. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of stressed livestock. The 5 bulls weren't loose, thank God. They were still in their individual, heavy-duty stalls, but they were far from calm. Usually placid creatures, they were now pacing restlessly, whites of their eyes showing, heads tossing. One had kicked at his stall door hard enough to splinter a board. Another was huffing loudly, a low, guttural sound of agitation. Something or someone had clearly spooked them badly. Nothing seemed obviously stolen. This wasn't a theft. This was an intrusion. My mind immediately flashed to Mitchell and Gary. Their escalating harassment, their demands for inspection, their veiled threats. The timing, the method, the lack of theft, it all pointed straight back to Havenwood. I stepped back outside, scanning the ground meticulously. Near the damaged door, I found distinct footprints in the dust. Multiple sets. Some looked like standard work boots, but others looked suspiciously like the loafers Gary always wore. More importantly, near the edge of my property line, I spotted faint but discernible tire tracks in a patch of damp earth. Tracks that hadn't been there when I left. Tracks leading directly back towards the pristine pavement of the HOA development. The pieces clicked into place with sickening clarity. They'd actually done it. They'd trespassed, broken my lock, and entered my barn. The audacity was breathtaking. My anger began to solidify into cold resolve. This wasn't just harassment anymore. This was criminal activity. I immediately pulled out my phone and dialed the sheriff's department, reporting a breaking and entering and vandalism. While waiting, I took dozens of photos. The broken lock, the damage to the door frame, the disturbed interior of the barn, the footprints, the tire tracks, evidence. A deputy arrived and listened patiently as I recounted the ongoing issues with Mitchell and the HOA, emphasizing their recent demands to inspect the barn and my refusal. He agreed the circumstances were highly suspicious, especially the lack of theft. Happens sometimes, he said. Folks in HOAs get territorial. Think their rules apply everywhere. He advised installing security cameras immediately. As his cruiser disappeared, I stood there staring at my violated barn. The image of those arrogant little men breaking in played in my mind. The feeling of vulnerability was quickly being replaced by a burning sense of indignation. They hadn't just crossed a property line. They'd crossed a fundamental line of decency and law. Okay, Mitchell, I thought. You wanted to escalate. Fine, let's escalate. But you're not going to like where it ends. The suburban grapevine works with astonishing speed, especially when fueled by minor injury and major embarrassment. Less than 2 hours after the deputy left, my friendly HOA neighbor, Sarah, called, her voice a mix of conspiracy and concern. You will not believe this, she started. Apparently, Mitchell and Gary had made quite the spectacle of themselves returning to the clubhouse earlier that afternoon. Sarah reported gleefully that Gary was sporting a noticeable limp. His normally immaculate chinos were ripped at the knee, and he seemed unable to put his full weight on one ankle. Mitchell looked less physically damaged, but was described as apoplectic, his face beet red, twigs in his hair, and a long scratch down his cheek. Their official story, already being spun by Mitchell via frantic emails to the board, was that they were conducting a routine perimeter inspection when they were unexpectedly confronted by aggressive livestock that appeared to have breached containment. They claimed they were merely investigating a potential safety hazard when the animals charged. It was pathetic, transparent, and utterly infuriating. But it also confirmed my suspicions entirely. They hadn't just peeked over the fence. They'd broken the lock, crept inside, and obviously startled the bulls. Those bulls, confined in their stalls, unable to flee, would have reacted defensively to sudden intruders in their space. A snort, a stomp, or a mock charge against the stall bars from a 3,000-pound animal in close quarters would be more than enough to send Mitchell and Gary scrambling for the exit like frightened mice. Gary's limp and ripped trousers likely tripped and fell in his haste to escape the terrifyingly contained animals. My first act was ordering a comprehensive security camera system. My second act was planning a confrontation. I waited until the following evening, knowing Mitchell often took a self-important stroll around the common area. I approached them calmly, phone openly recording audio. President Mitchell. Gary, I had a visit from the sheriff's department yesterday. Mitchell stopped, his eyes narrowing. Gary visibly flinched. My barn was broken into. Heavy-duty padlock destroyed. Mitchell puffed himself up. Yes, we heard about your unfortunate security lapse. Perhaps related to those dangerous animals you insist on keeping. Funny thing is, Mitchell, I continued, ignoring the bait. The break-in happened yesterday afternoon. Around the same time, several of your residents saw you and Gary returning from the direction of my property, looking rather distressed. Gary, you seem to have hurt your leg. We were inspecting a potential fence breach. Your bulls were acting aggressively. Mitchell's voice was rising, betraying his panic. So, you didn't break my lock? You didn't enter my barn without permission? I asked directly. Of course not. That's a baseless accusation. The sheriff has a report documenting the forced entry. I cut him off smoothly. And I have photos of the damage, the footprints, the tire tracks leading back here. Breaking and entering is a serious offense, Mitchell. Filing a false report about aggressive animals to cover it up probably isn't wise either. How dare you? Those bulls attacked us. They're a menace. It was the slip I needed. Attacked you. I pressed, letting a little steel enter my voice. Where? On my property? Inside my locked barn, perhaps? After you broke the lock to get in. The color drained from Mitchell's face as he realized what he'd inadvertently admitted. He saw the phone recording. He saw the dead end. This conversation is over. Any further communication will be through the HOA's legal counsel. He turned abruptly and practically dragged the limping Gary away. I didn't follow. I didn't need to. I had the recording. I had the evidence. And now I had his barely veiled admission. The game had changed. I compiled everything into a comprehensive evidence package. The sheriff's initial report, my photos of the broken lock, the disturbed interior, the audio recording of the confrontation, and Sarah's written statement detailing their disheveled return. I scheduled a consultation with a property rights lawyer. She confirmed, Mr. Mitchell has certainly handed you a gift-wrapped case. We had strong grounds for claims of trespass, vandalism, and destruction of property. More importantly, she illuminated a crucial angle: Peterson and Bernard's potential personal liability. HOA insurance policies exclude coverage for deliberate illegal acts. Breaking and entering was clearly illegal. If the insurance denied coverage, Mitchell and Gary could be sued personally for all damages, my legal fees, and punitive damages. She also pointed out the delicious irony regarding their alleged injuries. If they were injured while criminally trespassing on my property, they were responsible for creating the hazardous situation. My bulls, safely contained in their stalls, only reacted defensively because intruders broke in and startled them. Mitchell's attempt to paint himself as a victim was legally DOA. We drafted a formal demand letter addressed to Mitchell personally, CCing every single member of the HOA board of directors. The letter meticulously detailed the facts, the criminal trespass, the evidence, and the potential for personal liability due to the insurance exclusion. It demanded full reimbursement for the barn repair, the destroyed lock, the new security system, my legal fees, and a formal written apology. But I wasn't stopping there. I drafted a concise, factual summary of the incident and paid a high school kid $50 to discreetly place a copy of this notice in every single mailbox within Havenwood Estates late one evening. Let Mitchell try to control that narrative now. Finally, I followed up with the sheriff's department, providing them with Sarah's statement and the audio recording, and formally requested they escalate the investigation and consider filing criminal trespassing and vandalism charges against Mitchell and Gary. The delivery of the demand letter to Mitchell and the entire board had the impact of a wrecking ball hitting a Jenga tower. The mood shifted instantly from Mitchell's defiant bluster to sheer, unadulterated panic among the board members. Their lawyer likely advised them bluntly that Mitchell hadn't just stepped over a line. He'd pole-vaulted over it into a legal minefield, potentially dragging the entire HOA with him. My strategically distributed flyer was working its magic within the community. Homeowners, now facing the specter of financial liability, started calling board members demanding answers. Why hadn't they been informed? Would their dues go up to cover his legal battles? The narrative completely crumbled. The HOA's insurance carrier, notified of the brewing legal storm, predictably launched its own investigation and quickly assessed that Mitchell and Gary's actions fell squarely into the intentional illegal acts exclusion category. Insurance would not pay a dime for the damages or punitive damages. The final nail in Mitchell's coffin came from the sheriff's office. Facing the neighbor's statement and the audio recording, the sheriff's office found probable cause and formally charged both Mitchell and Gary with misdemeanor criminal trespass and vandalism. Facing criminal charges, civil liability without insurance backing, and a full-blown insurrection from the homeowners, Mitchell finally broke. The final settlement agreement was everything I demanded. The HOA paid for the full repair of the barn door, the destroyed lock, the entire cost of my new multi-camera security system, a significant upgrade, and reimbursed every penny of my legal fees. More importantly, the settlement included a formal, unambiguous written apology, signed by every member of the HOA board except Mitchell, acknowledging the illegal entry, affirming the HOA had no jurisdiction over my land, and pledging unequivocally that no HOA representative would ever trespass or interfere again. As part of the settlement, Mitchell and Gary were forced to resign immediately from the HOA board of directors and all related committees. Their reign of petty terror was over. Mitchell later pleaded no contest to the trespassing charge, receiving a fine and probation. Gary, ever the follower, received a similar deal. I watched them both shuffle out of the courthouse, stripped of their titles and their perceived power, looking small and insignificant. Back home, I supervised the installation of the final security camera aimed squarely at the property line where Mitchell and Gary used to lurk. The barn door was repaired, stronger than before. The bulls, entirely unaware of their role as unwitting catalysts for justice, munched contentedly in their pasture. Standing there in the quiet evening air, watching the sunset paint the sky behind my now fortress-like barn, I felt a profound sense of vindication. It wasn't just about winning. It was about restoring boundaries, about affirming the simple right to be left alone on one's own property. Mitchell and his ilk thrive on pushing limits, on intimidating those they think won't fight back. But sometimes, when they push too hard, they run headlong into something immovable. Whether it's the law, determined resistance, or just 15,000 pounds of very unimpressed bull. Remember, folks, know your property rights, document everything, and never, ever let a petty tyrant with a clipboard make you feel powerless on your own land. Sometimes all it takes is a little strategic thinking. And maybe, just maybe, having a few thousand pounds of backup doesn't hurt either.